So our first speaker this afternoon is Luke Jenkins. He'll be talking to us about the prehistoric discoveries associated with the A40 Llandewi Velfry to Redstone Cross improvements. So I'm really keen to find out a bit more about that. Luke is a field archaeologist at HENEB, the Trust for Welsh Archaeology. So obviously we had a talk this morning, so he's part of the successor to the Ddiwrnod Archaeological Trust and the other trusts as well. So he is a prehistorian who has worked across the British Isles, Europe and the Middle East, and then before he returned to his native Pembrokeshire. His interests include the Neolithic of Northwest Europe, the later prehistory of Wales and heritage management. So Luke, if I can ask you to just come up and deliver your talk.
Hello, good afternoon. My name's Luke, and I'm here today to talk to you about our prehistoric discoveries on the A40. I know what you're thinking, it's a slightly dull talk name, but it's the best we've got. I should start by acknowledging our partners in the scheme, Griffiths Civil Engineering, who are the main subcontractor on the scheme, the Welsh Government, who funded the scheme, Sgwrs Archaeology, who are the consultant, and the European Regional Development Fund, who funded it in the first place. I should also say I have talked on this day about this scheme before, but we did go back and do more, so it's not going to be a complete repeat, but we are going to start with that early stuff that we did. So this was a form of what we call development-led archaeology or commercial archaeology. And this is archaeology as a part of the planning process. This is where more than 90% of the archaeology done in the UK is done. So all of you imagining us sort of on cliffs being all romantic, actually most of it is on building sites. It has disadvantages, timescale being the big one, but it does also allow us to work at a much larger scale. Bigger budgets, more jobs fundamentally. This scheme had 17 archaeologists working pretty much full-time for 15 months on it. That's a lot of money and a lot of time. And it does offer us an opportunity to work at those scales that we wouldn't otherwise get to do. The scheme itself, I'm sorry to say, is that awful 30-mile-an-hour zone just to north of Narberth at the moment. It's a 6-kilometre highway with lots of other bits included, 2 new roundabouts, 2 new bridges, and a whole host of other things. For West Wales, this is an enormous infrastructure scheme. So for this part of the world, this is an enormous scheme. For other parts of the UK, it isn't. But in Pembrokeshire, it's fair to say we don't get that much development, and that in some ways is a good thing. But we don't get these big holes to explore the archaeological record in that big way that I've been talking about. I'm not going to mention the 30-mile-an-hour zone again, so you're just going to all have to accept it, and I'm going to focus on the archaeology, which is the happy bit. I'll run you through how these things work. We start with a very boring report at the start, which is called an environmental statement, which is based on a desk-based assessment of the archaeological record. This is where we go through and think, what do we know about the archaeology of the area? What might we expect? We then do a geophysical survey, which, as you can see in that photograph, involves walking up and down in a grid all the way along the scheme to produce something like this. This is a grayscale plot. And what it's looking at is basically a very posh metal detector, but down to the nanoteslas. And the reason that we can see archaeological remains in it is actually a quirk of the sun. So as the sun hits soil, it very, very slightly makes it more magnetic in sort of 1 or 2 nanoteslas. So if you have a ditch running through the center of your scheme, that silts up over time, and therefore you can see it in your survey. And there are some archaeological features in there that I'll point out a bit later. We then go through a very long process of trying to break it down even further. The high potential areas, we do strip map record, which for the purposes of this is full excavation. Medium potential, we do some trial trenching. We just have a check to see whether it's important or not. Low potential, we have an archaeological watching brief, and that just looks just in case, basically. That's archaeological supervision. So going back to that geophysical survey that I showed you a minute ago, we had this for the entire scheme, but this bit was one of the particularly interesting bits. For those of you trying to orientate yourself, that is Penblwyn roundabout. So north to the Preseli's, west to Haverfordwest, east to Carmarthen, south to Narberth. And in the centre of it, you can see a circular anomaly. That was our first in. There are actually several circular anomalies in there. We thought it was a barrow at the start. It was a barrow. And that gave us our first high potential area that we were going to look at. This is us on the first day of the excavation, emblazoned in high visibility clothing. This is what archaeologists look like a lot of the time, I'm sorry to say. Although we don't stay looking that clean for particularly long. This scheme ran, broadly speaking, from September through to May, so every bad month in the year. This is us on a snow day going out to dig holes, so anyone should take a moment once in a while to think of the poor archaeologists trying to sledgehammer through frost and that sort of thing. And there we are on that day on Penblwyn roundabout. I was supposed to encourage people to be archaeologists, I know, but February exists, unfortunately. So this is the scheme as it looked once we'd actually taken the top off. So actually, rather than the whole bit of that geophysics, we're just doing the trunk road. You can now drive through that. Many of you will have driven along it today. And this was the focus of the first bit of the excavation, those first sort of 7 or 8 months or so. There's archaeology in 3 places, broadly speaking, on the right-hand side, in the middle, and on the left-hand side. We're going to start on the right, because that was the oldest bit, and then run forward through time. We're going to start with some very small pits. That's a meter scale, and we're looking at them from above for anyone who's completely disorientated. So they're not big, but they're really, really important. These date to the Neolithic, what we're going to focus on for the majority of the afternoon, I'm delighted to say, dating to about 4,400 down to about 2,300 BC. And these pits actually dated from the earlier part of the Neolithic, somewhere between about 3,700 to about 3,300 BC. This is what they look like on the ground. They're not that impressive to look at, but you've got to realize these are 6,000 years old. They've been there a long time, and actually we're looking at just the bottoms of them, probably. But it wasn't the pits themselves that were interesting. This is the moment, basically, when we thought, oh, we might be on something here. These are 2 stone axes that have been left in the tops of those pits, although not the top of the pit originally. You'll notice both of the ends have been lopped off it. That's probably almost certainly intentional, what we sometimes call the deathing of the object or killing of the object, bringing that object to the end of its life, as it were. And in terms of those 2 axes, neither of them are local. One of them probably comes from Ireland. One of them comes from either North Wales or Cornwall, is the current understanding, just to give you a sense of how much people are moving around at this time. We also had a lot of pottery. This is basically the earliest pottery that we get in this part of the world. It's a form called carinated ware, which, the carination being the in-turn of the rim, is slightly developed form, and this was the first moment that we knew that we were in the earlier part of the Neolithic rather than the later part of the Neolithic. There was probably as much pot in that one pit dating to this period as has been found in West Wales in the last 30 or 40 years, to put it in perspective. That is a lot. We have several boxes full of stuff, and that is an enormous Neolithic assemblage. We also had stone tools, which many of you will associate with the time. Very little of it made of flint, it should be said, most of it mudstone, and that's probably because we don't have that much flint around here. We have rubbish flint, which you find in the beach cobbles and sometimes in the glacial tills. But we don't have high quality flint like they have in Ireland or in central southern Britain. So our stone tools look slightly different, but a nice assemblage of fairly normal things, domestic knives and that sort of thing, nonetheless. We also had slightly more unusual objects. In the pits, there was a collection of crystals. We had about 10 crystals within the pit. These were pretty big, and that's my finger, so to put it in perspective. They're about 1.5 inches long or so. They seem to have been intentionally placed within them. It wasn't just the finds themselves, though, that was exciting. I want you to put yourselves a little bit in the mind of an early Neolithic person, an early farmer. These are people who have recently settled in the UK. There are new people into the UK, new ideas, new beliefs, and we have no idea, broadly speaking, what those were. So what we try to pick that apart with is this kind of assemblage, as well as the megaliths and the stuff that Mike's going to talk about in a little bit. So just to demonstrate how people are leaving things in these pits, I'm not going to go through all 30 of the pits, don't worry. I'm just going to go through a few of them. Here they dug a hole, they lined the pit with pottery, but in a very particular way. The outside of the pottery always facing in and the inside always facing out, all the way around. That's sort of halfway through the excavation. They then fill it up a bit and leave that broken stone axe with its edges lopped off it. Another example, they dig a pit, they line it with knives this time, rather than pottery. They then make a little plinth in the middle and put the rock crystal on the plinth in the middle before backfilling it. What does that mean? It then gets weirder again. They dig a pit, they burn a little deposit of hazelnuts in the bottom of it, they deposit a large mudstone rock, they then put a crystal on the rock, they then cover that with a large shard of pottery, backfill it with burnt stone, and put the axe on top of that. Again, what does that mean? It was obviously important to them, and a lot of effort went into it, but uncovering what it actually means is a bit of a challenge, as you can imagine. We also had these very strange objects. The one on the bottom left and the bottom right are the same object reversed. They're little pieces of shale that have been carved. You can see they've had their edges beveled. They are all slightly different, but of the same theme. They're in different pits on their own. The one on the top left has a gash through the middle. This one has a hole in the middle. The bottom left and bottom right have holes in the middle, and then this one has a series of fine carvings, which we can't quite make out at the moment. We really don't know what these are, it's fair to say. I'm not going to give you many answers today, I'm sorry to say. But again, they've gone to quite a lot of effort to put them there. We've got two possible interpretations at the moment. These are them. You've got a Neolithic plaque on the left-hand side and cushion stones on the right-hand side. Neolithic plaques are basically little bits of art, little bits of mobile art dating to the Neolithic. The cushion stones on the right, they date to the Bronze Age a bit later. We don't have a date for these pits yet, the ones with which these pieces of shell come from, so we can't be sure they're Neolithic. This one was found with the Amesbury Archer, a very famous Bronze Age burial. Probability is the left-hand side is a better interpretation, but Neolithic plaques are very varied and very strange, and we don't understand them at all. So in terms of getting anywhere with the interpretation, it's really, really difficult. The one on the left is the Grey Cloyd Neolithic plaque, which is the only one that has ever been found in Wales. So we would have the second, third, fourth, and fifth. And if it's the one on the right, it's the first, second, third, and fourth. So we're really down into rare objects either way. We also had a fair amount of pits which didn't have anything in them. That's an important thing to point out. And that's probably not necessarily, it's probably not the case that they were empty originally. Given what we see in the others, it may just be that they're not the objects within them are not surviving. This was the last one we found. In the center, there is what we think is a polissoir. Andrew David, our lithics expert, seems to be fairly happy with that. Bottom left, sorry, I should explain. A polissoir is for the making of polished axes. If I go on to the next slide, you can see the groove in which you would have made that polished axe. A really nice thing. And around the edge, there are enormous blades, mostly made out of bluestone, funny enough, although I'm certainly not talking about any connections to Stonehenge here, although we're going in the right direction, I suppose. So what can we say about these pits? Well, we can say it's the deliberate deposition of important artifacts, with each pit having its own narrative, story, and function. It's not a single phase of deposition. They seem to be in 2s and 3s, and people are revisiting the site. And we think it's associated with the Paleo Channel, although we never quite managed to pin that down. And we can give it actually a fairly certain date at this point of the early Neolithic. They are part of a wider phenomenon that we recognize in the Neolithic, and those are Neolithic pit clusters. And within them, we see structural deposition, which is that process of putting things in a certain order to achieve something. What I'm pointing out in this bit below is that this is actual structured deposition. It is quite easy as archaeologists to slightly go over the top with our interpretation and infer meaning where there isn't any. But I think it's fairly obvious that they are meaning to do a lot of this. And there are quite a lot of firsts within the assemblage. So why? I'm not going to answer that question, and there's a lot of answers to seek going forward. I think we can say that this is a reflection of their cosmologies and ontologies, the cosmology being their understanding of the universe and their ontologies being their understanding of themselves. This is a period where we debate things like, do these people see themselves as individuals, as in, do they have more of a group identity? Do they live in nuclear families? Do they not live in nuclear families? There's a lot up for grabs here. Is this a reflection of their religious beliefs? We often shy away from using the word religion in prehistory, and that's because religion has certain tick boxes that many prehistoric religions wouldn't get to. But they also probably had a practical function. There probably wasn't the divide between domestic and ritual in the same way we understand it today. They were trying to achieve something in a very real way. At the bottom there, I put a couple of sort of quite often cited interpretations of these kinds of pits. One is planting. Julian Thomas is very keen on this, and that's the idea you put this stuff in the ground because you want more of it. But it could as easily be a votive offering, and there are dozens of other interpretations to go with. Hopefully, this is a particularly rich Neolithic pit cluster. We might be able to move that forward a bit. Moving down to the left-hand side of the site, or the west-hand side of the site, you can actually see the Preselles in the background for reference. And it's also a good point to recognize that Penblwyn is also a very nice hill. You don't notice it as you drive through it, but it's actually quite a long ridge looking down over the valley to the south, which then sweeps up towards the Preselles beyond. It's a really good bit of land. It would have always been a really good bit of land, and that's probably at least part of the reason that we see a density of stuff going on here. We move on to a very different kind of archaeology, and that's, you can see the team sort of posing around them. I like people posing in photographs. And this archaeology is very different, much less stuff. And what it is a series of palisades. You can see my meter scale on the right-hand side there with the post holes working along it. And a palisade is basically just a very sturdy fence with no cross bits. It's just post after post after post after post. It was a very difficult thing to understand, and it took a lot of excavation, and it had a slightly incoherent form, it would be fair to say. We did manage to tease it apart a little bit. So the original structure seems to be this trapezoid structure in the middle, which then, so this is it again here, which they then expand to the south, which is on the left here, much more substantially with much bigger posts, and then they expand to the east, up here, where we start to lose it a bit. It's a fairly sprawling set of enclosures, which seem to then be built and rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt. Again, we don't really understand this, but it's very, very nice anyway. The only date we have for it, I didn't mean to put that one in, to be honest, that's for a different part of the site, is this one. And that's between about 3,300 to about 3,100 BC. So we've moved on a little bit in time from the pits, but not much. We're talking the centuries afterwards as much as anything. And that is still a best guess because we haven't had the wider scheme of dating that's going on at the moment. That puts us still in the Neolithic, a little bit later, what we'd be itching towards the middle Neolithic, where things do start to change a little bit. different cultures, different ideas, and indeed more people coming into the UK again. The Neolithic is a series of migrations we're now starting to understand much more. Form and function, it could be that it's domestic. It's not how we understand domestic buildings during this time. They tend to be sort of isolated rectangular buildings in the landscape rather than sort of sprawling structures. And if you were to give these ideas, sort of recognize them as buildings within fenced enclosures, it's a fairly sprawling, almost sort of village-like setup, which would be a very nice thing indeed. It would be a new thing if it is domestic. It could also form, again, some kind of ritual structure or the like that we haven't seen before. Part of the problem there, though, is what I talked about at the beginning, and that's that we don't open many big holes in Pembrokeshire. There could be one of these on a lot of hills in Pembrokeshire, and we just simply wouldn't know. Going back to the middle of the site, and something that we can interpret, I'm pleased to say, and that's that barrow that led us there in the first place. We only saw half of it, much to my frustration. Everyone desperately wanted to go the other way, and actually I can see Tom in the audience digging that hole on the left-hand side. Very nice. It had a bit of beaker in it, and beakers, so we have moved on in time. So we're now talking about the Bronze Age, about 2300 to 43 AD. The beaker people come along a little bit beforehand at the end of the Neolithic, and they bring with them new ideas, new cultures, and a whole new society, really. We often call it the rise of individualism. It's when we start to see people more definitively within the archaeological record. We start to see individuals more, if you were to be technically right. At the center of a barrow, there is a person. That person is important, and they've been buried there. Further out, there's often secondary burials who are less important, etc., etc., etc. You also start to see a lot of ornamentation within the burials, with the most famous of which, of course, is the beaker. They're almost always buried with a pot. The pot is a beer cup, for anyone who's wondering. These are people buried with their beer cups on the whole. And in fact, those beer cups gradually get bigger, and then they're cremated in their beer cups by the end of the Bronze Age. So, it's been around a long time, and it was always very important. There's also another one adjacent to the roundabout, just there. There it is. I think I skipped through all the talking about this without going through the slides, I'm sorry to say. Moving to the south, we had another enormous hillside to clean. This one took even longer. That was the morning job that no one appreciated, it would be fair to say. And here we had a very different kind of archaeology. The team are actually sitting in the structures that we had here. These date to the Bronze Age again, probably the earlier part of the Bronze Age. And actually what we were finding were little tent-like structures or little shelters, rather than these sort of enormous structures that we were seeing to the north of the road. Here's one. They are very small. This one actually sat within its own little enclosure. And they all had with them a little collection of features. So this one had a nice little hearth made out of burnt stone. This one had a cooking pit, very nice again. And also often storage pits, usually with a quern in the bottom, that I suspect have been left behind. Interpreting these is quite difficult, especially as the early Bronze Age is a bit of a void within the archaeological record. Whilst we find a dead person on top of most of the hills, we have a lot of problem finding out where they live. We don't know why that is. Probably it's just a change in the way that they're using the landscape. And it might be that actually these smaller structures are representative of a more mobile community. These are not structures you would see unless you open very big holes again. So again, it might be part of that story. I'm just going to finish off by talking about burnt mounds. We dug so many of them on the scheme, I couldn't not. Burnt mounds are the weirdest things in the archaeological record, I would say. There's a bit of a theme in this talk, I know, but these are very, very strange. They're also really, really difficult to dig because they are composed entirely out of burnt stone or heat-affected stone and charcoal. And as you can, this one here, we've taken out 2/4 of it. It's 16 meters across, 14 meters wide, and they mostly date to the Bronze Age. Again, that sort of 2,300 mark. This is Ellen posing for scale. These really are massive accumulations of charcoal. We do understand something about what they were doing there, and that's that they were heating water. Underneath, usually, these massive massive heaps of burnt stone, you find troughs. So the troughs, what they're doing is they're heating stone and they're throwing the stone into troughs of water, and that heats the water actually very effectively. What we all disagree about is why they are heating such enormous amounts of water, often for a very, very long time. You know, some of these sites are used for 1,000 years, to put it in perspective. So they're returning to this site for 1,000 years to heat water, and no one has quite worked out why that is. There are plenty of interpretations out there, and all of them have their problems. One of the interpretations, of course, is cooking, which I imagine is what you were all thinking of. You never find any animal bone on them in majority. Equally, there has been a bit of a breakthrough recently with people finding sort of fats within the stone itself, which is, might solve that question a bit. Another one is brewing. We're talking about the Bronze Age. Beer was probably a pretty important thing, but also you find drugs in the environmental sample. That might be part of it. It's a Bronze Age party spot to some extent. Tanning is another one that's quite often posited, but no one has ever managed to get us across the line on that. And it might be that they're used for a whole series of things that have come along with this new beaker culture, which seems to take over most of Europe during this time. And that actually all of those things are saying that these are the central places in the landscape, which is a theme that you see in these, particularly the later Neolithic and early Bronze Age features, is a lot of the monuments that we see, apart from the burial mounds, they're all about meeting places or waypoints or that sort of thing. We're talking standing stones, stone circles, that sort of thing. They weren't all that big. That one, the last one, was 16 meters across. This one was barely a meter across, so they're not all huge. So, again, that picture may be more complex than we're recognizing. Just a couple of human beings for scale. I can see Haley in the audience somewhere as well. This one was right in the middle of the road, and I think is quite good at sort of demonstrating how we work in development-led archaeology. These are 50-ton dump trucks working around us, and the road was so we were fair play for this one in the way, it's fair to say. We were taking our time because we had another burnt mound. The trough was here. The burnt mound was off to the south, and we didn't actually get to see it. There's the hearth and the working area where they were processing the stone. The thing that made this one really, really exceptional is with it, we had this amazing lozenge-shaped stone. The lozenge is a motif that we do see a lot in the Bronze Age. There's plenty of interpretations as to what that looks like, which I'm not going to go into during this talk. This one has holes drilled through it, and it's a very strange object again. I think that's the theme of the excavations on the A40, it would be fair to say. I have talked about prehistory. I have offered no answers whatsoever, but I hope I've given you something to think about. We did also have things that were historic as well. This is a nice Roman bead, and this is a really nice early medieval house, which is sat on top of the Pembrokeshire Hill. You can see our lovely archaeology site that we spent 7 months cleaning is now gone in that photograph, and actually this is just on the peripheral bit. So what can we say? Well, we can say it's an important place and that it was used for a very long time. We have some new forms of archaeology that we need to go away and think about. And I think it also really demonstrates the importance of development-led archaeology. And it gives us an amazing new assemblage to study in the future. So what's next? Well, the environmental processing is mostly done. The C14 is just starting. The specialist analysis and reporting, all those finds I showed you are currently scattered across Britain with the various specialists. Fieldwork reporting mostly involves me sitting in a darkened room pulling my hair out for 6 months or so, and then we'll be moving on to publication. The publication, we hope, will have there'll be an academic one as well as one that people might actually want to read in majority. I'll just finish off by thanking the enormous team that made this project possible. It's not me who digs most of the holes. I'm mostly responsible for risk assessments and planning what's next. It was a slog, this one. It was an amazing dig, and we had some amazing finds, but it was tricky. So I'd like to thank everyone who was involved. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.